Back when I was a sophomore in high school, my family moved to a new city. We lived in the same state, but about 2 hours away from where we used to live, due to my mother changing jobs. I liked the move because we were in an area with more things to do now. Before, we had lived more out in the country. However, what I didn't like was that I didn't know anybody in the area, and I didn't really have any friends yet. I would have to change schools and go to a different high school than I did my freshman year. My old school only had about 50 kids in each grade, and my new school had about 200. When I started out, most people there seemed nice, but I didn't really make any good friends. But about the second week of school, there was a kid who I'm just going to call Joe for this story. Joe was also new to this school. We had a gym class together, and we became friends because we were partners in some gym game that we played. We also had our 5th hour class together, and he quickly became my best friend. Most days, we would talk at any opportunity and would work on homework together during class if the teacher gave us time, things like that. We also would eat at the same lunch table. A few weeks went by, and I started making some new friends, but I still considered Joe to be my best friend. Joe had sort of long brown hair, glasses, and was average height. He was pretty nice for the most part, but he occasionally would say or do some weird things. He and I did not have much in common at all, other than being new students in this school and having 2 classes together. Most of our interests were different. I would say that we mostly just talked about school and just basic stuff. One time Joe said that we should hang out after school, and I told him sure. I gave him my address, and he was going to come over after school on the next Friday. This was probably about a month into the school year now. When Friday arrived, I asked Joe if he was still coming over after school that day. He told me no. He said that he couldn't anymore because he had forgotten about something that he had going on. He said maybe next week though. I wasn't that disappointed, and I would probably just do what I usually did on Friday nights anyways, which was play video games. After school that day, I went home and did just that. I took some breaks to eat and things like that, but luckily for me, I remembered that I didn't have much homework to do at all that weekend. I stayed up sort of late, which I usually did on weekends. I went to bed at probably 1 o'clock in the morning after I got really sleepy. Our house was a 1-story home, and my bedroom was on the front side of the house. My brother's bedroom was next to mine, and my parents' was across the hallway next to the bathroom. After I fell asleep, I woke up to the sound of some noise in my room. I was really disoriented at first, because I must have been sleeping pretty deeply. After hearing another noise, I sat up in my bed to see what was going on. The room remained mostly dark, like when I had fallen asleep, except for my TV screen in the corner of the room. But there was another light coming from my window. I looked to it and realized that my window was open. I normally had drapes covering the window when I slept, but they were partly moved to the side, and I could see my window was slid up. I then looked to the floor beneath the window, and a figure was there. When I saw it, I jumped back in my bed. That's when I saw the figure stand up, and it was Joe. I said nothing, probably because I was so shocked. He looked at me and started snickering a little bit, like a quiet laugh. Finally, I asked him what he was doing here. He didn't answer me at first, and just sort of stood there. Then he said, "Nothing." I really didn't know what to say. I guess I was thinking of what I should ask him out of the thousands of questions going around in my head, but my mind was still a little bit groggy. Before I got the chance though, he moved back over to the window. Then he jumped back outside and shut the window on his way out. I was then wide awake and went to the window and looked outside of it. I just barely saw Joe now walking away down the street. He must have gotten in easily through the window because I typically slept with my window open just a crack, but why would he even come to my house? I looked at the clock and it was almost 4 o'clock in the morning. It took me a little while, but eventually I was able to fall back asleep. When Monday came the following week, I planned to ask Joe what that was all about, but Joe wasn't at school that day. In fact, I didn't see Joe for the rest of the semester. I did see him during the next semester in the hallway a couple of times, but I didn't get the opportunity to talk to him. After that school year, he must have changed schools again because I never saw him again after that. In recent years, I've tried to look Joe up on social media, but I've never been able to find him. He has a fairly common name, and I don't know exactly what he would look like now or where he is. I think he was probably going to try and steal from me that night, but I caught him in the act. I used to go to Starbucks all the time. I would say at least 2 or 3 times a week I would stop at Starbucks for coffee on my way to work. I would order online every time as I left my house and then pick it up on my way. I got it so often that some of the employees started to recognize me, and I would be friendly with a few of them. Sadly though, the lines at the location I usually went to were always super long, and one day I realized another Starbucks that was also on my way to work. I made the choice to switch locations to see if it would be faster, and it was in fact quite a bit faster every single day, and it saved me some time. After I would say about a couple of weeks of going to the new location, one day I forgot to place my order online. It wasn't a big deal, but I would just have to order at the drive-thru at the Starbucks. When I got there, the voice on the other end of the speaker of the drive-thru said hi to me and called me by my name. This surprised me because I had only been to that location 3 or 4 times at that point, and it wasn't a daily basis or anything. I also didn't recognize the voice as it was a man's voice, and all the people I knew from the previous location were females. I pulled up to the next window after I ordered, and a man with a headset came to the window. I paid and he handed me my coffee and smiled. He once again said my name and told me to have a nice day, then he winked at me. The man was rather tall and had sort of long dark hair with a slight beard. I have to say I had never seen him before, but beyond that I really didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until every single time that I would go to Starbucks after that, he would be working and would always be the one to hand me my order. Each time he would wink at me or have an almost creepy grin on his face. None of this really bothered me though, but it did feel a little bit strange. Then I stopped seeing the man. There were different people every time when I got my coffee in the morning, and I didn't really notice the fact that I wasn't seeing this strange guy anymore. One of the times I went inside to pick up my coffee and was walking back to my car when suddenly I saw the man again. He was in the parking lot and he approached me as I was getting into my car. I didn't really recognize him at first. It took me a few seconds. He said hi to me and smiled and asked me how I was doing. I said fine in a confused tone and asked what he wanted. He then asked me how the movie I watched last night was. Then he winked at me like the past times and walked away. I stood there next to my car in shock. I had in fact been watching a movie the previous night, but I had no idea how he knew about it. I was really creeped out, and for me, this was the last straw with the man from being slightly weird to completely creepy. I had no idea who this guy was other than the fact that he worked at the Starbucks and was creepy. I decided to go back inside the Starbucks and ask another employee who he was. I first looked around the parking lot, but the man was gone. I then walked inside the Starbucks, which was relatively busy, but nothing too crazy. I went to the counter and asked who the man was with longer brown hair, a slight beard, and pretty tall. I was told in response that it sounded a lot like a guy named Jonathan, who had worked there but had been fired for inappropriate behavior around the workplace. They said he had worked at another location close by, but had moved to that location shortly before getting fired. I briefly told my story. I was told by several people that they thought he seemed creepy and had apparently followed one of his coworkers home one night. It gave me the chills as I realized this Jonathan guy most likely was outside of my house the previous night and saw me watching a movie. So many thoughts started to race through my head, such as how did he know where I lived, and had he followed me home or been to my house before? I had to go to work at that point, so I left, but throughout the day I texted with several of my friends about what had happened. Later that day I got home from work and asked my friend Lisa to come over and keep me company. I got home and shortly after heard the sound of Lisa pulling up. I was so relieved because I really didn't want to be alone in my house that night after what had happened. But then I received a text from Lisa saying that she would be there in about 15 minutes. I went over to look out the window and noticed a different car driving slowly down the street outside my window. I lived in a quiet neighborhood and there wasn't a whole lot of cars that went down the street, so I sort of noticed when they did. It was a black car and the windows were tinted. It parked across the street, but slightly past my house. Of course, I was paranoid and worried that it was the Jonathan guy. I watched the car from my window, hoping to see anybody get out of the car that wasn't Jonathan from Starbucks. But nobody was getting out. Then my phone started to vibrate and ring in my left hand as I held the living room curtain open with my right. It just about gave me a heart attack, and I closed the curtain and looked at who was calling me. It was a number that I didn't recognize. I decided to answer it. The voice on the other end was the familiar voice of Jonathan. I heard him ask me why I was watching him and told me to come outside. I freaked out at this and screamed as loud as I could that I was calling the police. He then hung up on me and I opened the curtain slightly to see his car pulling away. I then called the police and they said they would be on their way. They arrived a short time later along with Lisa. I gave them as much information as I could on Jonathan and I stayed at Lisa's house the next few nights.
Finally, I was told that Jonathan had been found, and I would no longer have to worry about him anymore. He had worked at the first Starbucks I had been to almost every day, and apparently asked to transfer when he realized I had gone to another one. I just wonder how long he knew where I lived, or how many times he had been to my house without me noticing.
When I was around 7 years old, my family and I moved into an old house. It was a really big house with 4 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 2 living rooms, and even had a dumbwaiter. It was at least 80 years old and was in pretty good condition for a house that old. My parents both worked 12-hour shifts at a hospital and would oftentimes have to get a sitter for me. My current babysitter, who I looked up to dearly, had moved away over 2,000 miles to another state to start her career in law. Needless to say, I wasn't doing well because of it. She had been with us for over 6 years and even considered her as family. Anyway, with her now gone, my parents had to look for a new babysitter. We had lived in a town where there weren't many sitters, meaning there was a better chance for them to have low reviews. Thankfully, we had found one who lived in walking distance that had 4-star reviews, which wasn't bad but still convenient. Her name was Sandra, and she seemed really nice. She was 24, attended college, and was apparently really good with kids. We'd play games together, she'd help me with my homework, watch TV, etc. My parents got along well with her, and as the weeks went by with her as my new babysitter, I started to see her a lot like my previous one. While all of this was great for both my parents and I, something happened during a visit that would change my whole perspective of her. It was a Friday night, and my parents were on a weekend trip to the Bahamas for their anniversary, and I was with Sandra. She had bought me some pizza and sat down with me to watch SpongeBob to keep me company. We watched for about an hour or so before she tells me to get ready for bed. Now, I was never the rebellious type of kid, so I complied and went up to bed to go to sleep. I fall asleep almost instantly and probably slept for a good 2 hours or so when I woke up to a steady banging noise. It was pretty loud, especially from my room, and kind of sounded like someone hitting a hammer against a wooden door. I turn on my light and quietly tiptoe down the stairs to the living room where the noise was coming from. I descend into the living room where the light was on, and what I saw next will forever stay with me. Sandra had been facing the back door while forcefully hitting her head on it. On the floor was a small puddle of blood that was coming from her nose, as well as blood dripping down the door. Being only 7, I tried to process as to what I was seeing, but I was just simply petrified. I let out a loud scream across the house and got on the house phone to dial 911. I spoke with the operator, trying my best to describe what it was that I was seeing. All the while, I'm screaming at Sandra to please stop, but she didn't seem to care or acknowledge me. I'm still on the phone with the police, giving them my address and to please come as soon as possible. The police heard the banging in the background and arrived in minutes with 3 officers restraining Sandra. She tried to resist no matter what, leaving one of the officers with no choice but to tase her. They called for an ambulance, and one of the officers called my parents, letting me know the situation. That night, my aunt came to stay with me at her house until my parents got back. As for Sandra, she had been rushed to the hospital where she regained consciousness and suffered from severe injuries. According to my parents, Sandra doesn't remember any of it or what had happened. All she remembered was her on the couch with her phone when she felt dizzy and got up until everything went black. Till this day, it's still unclear as to what had happened that day or what it was. Either way, it's one of the most horrifying encounters I've ever witnessed. When I was about 11, my family and I moved into a new home in Los Angeles. It wasn't anything too big, just a one-storied home appropriate for a family of 3. I attended a private school in the city and was a naturally socially awkward child. This will be important in the story later. I'd also like to mention that I have autism, meaning it was hard for me to make friends and interact with others. Both my parents were fully aware of this and had made me go through therapy and other medication to help me with it. While it did improve a little bit, I still had some challenges I had to deal with. Anyway, we had moved to Cali as my dad had other work there with a higher salary. This meant that he'd most of the time be working and not at the house. I mean, my mom would sometimes watch over me, but she worked too and would sometimes have to get a babysitter. My current babysitter, who I adored, had recently moved over 2,000 miles away for a better job. It was sad, but that was the reality, and we had to find another sitter. Eventually, my mom had found me a new sitter who wasn't like the old one, but was still manageable. Her name was Luna, and she claimed to be just 19 years old. She was nice, but had a few issues that I began to take notice from for the first few visits. While it wasn't anything too concerning, they were very much noticeable. At first, it was relatively minor things like twitching and loss of focus. However, these things began to turn into bigger problems, all the way from talking to herself to sometimes asking me weird questions. I could only assume that she had some sort of disorder and remembered feeling sympathy toward her. The first night I met Luna was when both of my parents had their anniversary and another time where they both had work. I'd say these tics didn't arise until the third visit of babysitting where I started to take notice. But the more she babysat me, the worse the tics would get. It wasn't until one night, though, where she did something that really pushed the limit. It was Valentine's Day of 2014, and my parents had gone out in the city for a nice dinner. This meant that I would be home with Luna until they got back. For the first hour, she helped me with my homework, and then we played a game. Things went well for the most part, and even though I barely interacted with her, I wasn't rude. I remember giving her a hard time when it was my bedtime that night. It was stupid of me, but keep in mind, I was an 11-year-old boy that didn't want to sleep. Eventually, however, I ended up complying and went to sleep without any problems. Looking back, however, I'd say I slept for a good few hours or so before I awoke to my bedroom door being opened. Thinking it was just a draft, I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. However, that was when I hear my door open a little more and there was someone standing in the corner of my room. The figure then slowly walks over toward me, coming to a complete stop. At first, I couldn't see who it was, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, my light from my nightlight revealed Luna standing at the edge of my bed. I turn on my light and Luna immediately apologizes, telling me she's sorry and that she tends to sleepwalk. In her hand was one of my dad's power drills with the battery taken out. She went on with more excuses while trying to tell 2 separate stories about why she had it. Of course, being only 11, I had my suspicions, but it wasn't enough to see her as a threat. Later that night, my parents had come home and paid her. It wasn't until the next morning where I woke up and told my parents about Luna and what she did. They of course flip out and attempted to call Luna multiple times. My mom had also found empty bottles of her prescription medication gone. However, Luna denies any wrongdoing, and police couldn't actually do anything since she technically didn't commit a crime. It all makes no sense, and it does until this day. Luna never babysat for me again after that, and I hope I never see or hear from her again. I still will never know for sure what she was planning on doing with that power drill, and it still haunts me from time to time.
This story happened about a year ago. I worked for a company where I would have to travel occasionally for work projects. During one work project in particular, I carpooled and traveled with a coworker named Jake to an area about 4 hours away. I will start out by saying that even before my trip, my overall impressions of Jake were that he was sort of weird. I wasn't all that excited about the idea of just he and I traveling together for work, but when Jake asked me to carpool with him, I just said, sure. Immediately, I hated myself for saying yes so fast, but I didn't want to insult him by saying no. Plus, he offered to do all the driving. I figured that without having to drive, I could tolerate him, and we left that morning and had a long and busy day of work. By the time we were done on location, we had some things that we needed to wrap up. Ideally, we would do this back at the office, but we were 4 hours away and it was already 7 p.m. We drove back and got within about an hour away, but we were both really tired. Jake said that he thought he was too tired to make it back to the office. However, his apartment was only 20 minutes down the road and said I could sleep over if I wanted. The truth is, I didn't want to, but I didn't really have a choice and figured it wouldn't be too bad, so I agreed. When we got to his apartment, I saw that there was already a sleeping bag next to his couch. He said I could sleep in the sleeping bag on the couch, and overall, his place was decent. I pretty much went right to bed after the long day of work, but I woke up suddenly from my deep sleep. The sleeping bag that I was in was as if it was zipped shut completely. It was over my head and I couldn't see anything. I felt around to try to lift the sleeping bag from where my head was, but I couldn't find the top of it. Then I realized what was going on. The top of the sleeping bag was being held shut. It was really hot in there and I was sweating. I also felt like I was running out of air. I tried sitting up, but it was difficult. I was still being held down, and I realized that somebody must be holding the top of the sleeping bag closed. I started hitting at the area and trying to wiggle myself off the couch. At last, I was able to escape. Whoever had been holding the sleeping bag closed was now gone. When I felt the cool, fresh air from the rest of the room hit me, it was refreshing. But as I did, I looked around the very dark living room, and I saw what appeared to be Jake disappearing into the hallway towards his bedroom, and then I heard the door quietly close and lock. Why had Jake done this to me? Was he joking or was he serious? It definitely wouldn't be a good joke to nearly suffocate someone and then run away in the middle of the night. I was wide awake now, and I looked at the clock. It was 5 a.m., and I had been sleeping for a good 6 hours or so. We would have to leave for work in only a few more hours, so I just went on my phone and stayed up for the rest of the night. I really didn't want to take a risk going back to sleep after what had just happened. When it was about 7 a.m., I got ready to leave and waited for Jake to get up. He got up several minutes later and asked if I was ready to go, then we left. I didn't want to bring up the night before of what had happened, and I was wondering if he would, but he didn't. We drove the next 30 minutes to work in almost silence, and it was pretty awkward. After we got to work, we finished up the project, and thankfully, I didn't have to work with Jake for the rest of the day or the next day. And after that, I never saw him again. Like 2 weeks later, when I hadn't seen him at all, I asked a coworker who told me that Jake had been fired. I wasn't able to find out from anybody why he was fired though, but I was glad that he was gone. I remember that I had been friends with him on Facebook, so I searched for him, but he was now gone from Facebook. I thought maybe he deleted me, but after searching, I still couldn't find him. I'm not sure what happened to him or where he went, but I'm almost certain that he tried to suffocate me that night.
When I was in my late teens, I worked at a little coffee shop in my city. And this was around the time that smartphones hit the scene. I had just gotten my first phone and laptop. Anyway, we had this one regular customer who was very eccentric. He made me really uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. He had strange vibes. It was in the middle of a scorching summer, and he always wore many layers and a large parka with faux fur trim and sunglasses. I never once saw his eyes. He would get out of his car and run for the door in his big coat, shielding himself from the sun. He always ordered almost every item on the menu, but always said it wasn't for him, and that he didn't like the food there personally. One day, he came in and ordered the whole menu as per usual. I was checking him out at the cash register, and he leaned in and softly said to me, "You seem like a nice young woman. I need to warn you about something. I'm not supposed to tell anyone, but it honestly bothers my conscience keeping this information to myself." "What is it?" I asked. "Do you have a computer or smartphone?" he asked me. "Yes, I just got one," I answered. "Get rid of it, immediately," he said sternly. Why's that?" I asked. "I have a friend who has certain government ties. Nothing is private. The government will be monitoring everything, and it's all permanent. He told me they're planning to put up concentration-type camps in some major US cities. They'll use the info on your cell phones to decide who will go and where they will go. I've gotten rid of everything that can be traced, and I'm planning on running away soon. Please be safe," he urged. He left, and I kinda just shrugged him off as a crazy person, but it still weighed heavy on my mind a while. I went on to leave that job, and got a job as a hostess at a restaurant. About a year passed, and I'd pretty much forgot about the whole encounter, until one day, we crossed paths again. I was at the front host stand, where I greet and seat guests arriving at the restaurant, when a limousine pulls up, and a man gets out, accompanied by 2 large bodyguards at his side. It was the guy from the coffee shop. This time, he was wearing a sleek tuxedo and the same sunglasses. He entered the building and says, "You remember me?" I said I did. He said, "Do you remember what I said?" Again, I told him yes. He proceeds to pass the host stand and examines every inch of the restaurant as if he was looking for something. He then signals his bodyguards to follow him to the door. Before exiting the building, he says, looking back at me, "Don't forget." He got back in the limousine, and I never saw him again after that. It was the strangest thing ever, because it's like he knew he'd find me there. How? How did he find me at my new job? Perhaps he asked someone at my old job, but still, why go out of your way to make some flashy appearance like this? I just randomly thought about this, and was wondering whatever became of that man, and who the hell he was.
My name is Emily. Many years ago, when I was a little kid, I had a best friend named Jenna. We met during kindergarten, I remember, and we liked a lot of the same things. We went to school together and hung out all the time for like 2 years. However, after 2nd grade, Jenna and her family moved away, and I didn't get to see her anymore. Obviously, we were little kids, and this was a long time ago, so we weren't able to stay in touch. I ended up making a bunch of new friends over the years, and I sort of forgot about Jenna. I would occasionally remember her in the fun times that we had, and I would wonder how she was doing. Unfortunately, I never would know, and the older and busier I got, the less I would remember her. Well, about a year ago, out of nowhere, I received a friend request on Facebook from Jenna. I'll leave out her last name. At first, I didn't know who she was, but I soon remembered. I couldn't believe that she had found me. I didn't really recognize her in her picture because we were both adults now, and I hadn't seen her since we were like 7. I sent her a message, and soon after, we were messaging each other daily. Basically, we were just catching up and telling about ourselves now. It was kind of weird because we hadn't been friends in such a long time that it felt like I was meeting her for the first time, but also we had been such good friends in the past. She said that she lived in St. Louis now. I lived in Atlanta, and I told her that, and she replied that she traveled there for work all the time. She said that she would be here in 2 weeks. I thought this was too good to be true and offered her to stay at my house. At first, she declined and she said that she would get a hotel, but I insisted. I thought that it would be a great idea. I lived by myself in a smaller house and was interested in spending time with my old best friend. 2 weeks later, she came into town and I welcomed her into my home. We got along great. We would both leave for work at the same time, and when we got off, I would show her cool places around the city and things like that. However, one night, I woke up to a noise inside my house. I was in my bedroom, and Jenna was staying in the one spare bedroom that I had. I quickly realized that she must be up for some reason. It was 3 a.m., and I rolled back over to go back to sleep. But the noises just seemed strange. The noises weren't of somebody just walking, but more the sounds of somebody moving something around. It sounded like it was coming from the living room. I got up quietly and made my way to the doorway and looked out. From there, I could see the hallway and part of the living room. In the hallway, there was 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a closet. I looked out and saw the bathroom door was open and the light was off. The guest bedroom door was closed and that light was off as well. I started to wonder if Jenna was still sleeping and maybe somebody had broken in or something. I kept looking out and into the living room. I could now tell that that was where the noises were coming from. The noises continued on and off for another minute or so. Then someone came into my view. It didn't take me long to see that it was Jenna. I didn't know what she was doing though. For some reason, I didn't want to call out to her either. It looked as though she was looking for something. I decided to just go back to bed. The next morning, I asked Jenna if she had slept good. She said yes, and then I told her I thought I heard a noise in the house. I was basically trying to find out what she was doing without directly asking her. She said that was strange because she had slept right through the night. I told her it must have been nothing, but I was a little suspicious now. She was only staying with me for 2 more days at that point. The next night, I slept good and didn't wake up at all. But the one after that, which was Jenna's last night of staying there, was different. I woke up in the middle of the night once again. When I did, I heard some noises inside my bedroom this time. They were quiet, but loud enough to wake me up apparently. I looked over and saw Jenna crouched down, going through my desk drawers. I was going to say something, but I couldn't. For some reason, I decided to pretend that I was sleeping again. I could hear her trying to be quiet and going through my things. As I was laying there, I was able to get up the courage and I sat up and spoke. I said, "Jenna, what are you doing?" Jenna stopped and turned around. She looked shocked to see me. She then got up and walked quickly out of the room. She shut my door behind her. I then heard her go into my spare bedroom where she had been staying. Then, less than a minute later, she exited that room and walked out of the house. Then she drove off. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I had no idea what to do, so I went back to bed. The next morning, when I got up, I looked to see that she had blocked my number and blocked me on Facebook. I also later found that she had stolen several items from my house. Looking back at this, I should have never let her stay with me. For someone I hadn't seen in so long, it wasn't a smart idea. I also wonder how she found me again and why she did that to me.
This is a story that happened to me when I was around 24 years old. I recently moved to Boston for an internship to help prepare for my field of study since I had just graduated from school. However, it wasn't a paid internship, and the money I did make was from my disability insurance. This meant that I had to find a job in order to make income. After days of searching for jobs, I finally found one as a part-time babysitter. I was good with children and figured babysitting wouldn't be bad for a first job. However, little did I know that those expectations were far from true. Ever since I had moved, I had babysat for a while now and have dealt with many different kids, but this kid takes the prize. I won't disclose personal information about her, but we'll call her Rachel. Rachel was around 9 and was the small blonde girl who was obsessed with dolls. She basically liked any type of dolls. Antique dolls, rag dolls, Barbie dolls, you name it. One time, I had babysat for her for 2 days as her parents would be out of town. She was nice, but wasn't very talkative and just mainly played with her dolls and tended to them. I would be staying in the guest bedroom, and, of course, there were dolls. I remember this one porcelain doll sitting on a chair beside the bed I'd be sleeping in. It was a very unnerving doll, the type where it felt like you were being watched by it whenever you moved. I thought nothing of it and just got ready for bed and made sure Rachel was asleep. It was around 11 p.m. and I had got ready for bed and went to sleep with ease. I'd say I slept for a good hour or so before waking up to the sound of something in the room. I wake up and take a look at the clock and saw that it was 1 a.m. The second I turned on the light, I take a look around the room and see that the doll's head had been rotated backwards. Thinking it was probably Rachel pulling a joke, I turned the doll's head and went over to her room. However, Rachel seemed to be fast asleep and didn't seem like she had gotten out of bed. I shut her door and go back to my room, and the doll had now fallen off the chair. I didn't even dare touch it and just shut the door and slept on the couch. When morning came, I wasn't gonna bother Rachel with questions about the doll, so I ignored it and waited for the parents to arrive. I got paid and left the house and refused to babysit for Rachel again. When they did call me, I simply declined and claimed that I had gotten another job. I haven't experienced anything paranormal like that again, and I have moved past it. This story has shocked me to my core ever since, and I've even developed a fear of dolls. Whenever I see one, I always walk away.
My name is Sophie, and this happened several years ago when I was in college. I went to a very large university in the United States. The college had quite a bit of students, and most places you would go throughout campus, you would see many different people. Throughout my first couple of years at the college, I made quite a few friends and would hang out with them all the time. However, most of my college friends were not in the same major as me and were not in my classes. My classes were also very large, and there would be over 100 people in them. During the beginning of my junior year, I was sitting next to a girl named Jordan in one of my classes. She introduced herself to me the first day after I sat down. We were both sitting in the back because we only arrived a few moments before class started, and most of the seats were already taken. The next day, we both sat in the same places again. Over time, we spoke more and more and soon became good friends. We both had the same major, and Jordan told me that she had transferred from another university. As the semester went on, we started studying for our classes together in the library occasionally. Eventually, we hung out at each other's places sometimes. I lived in a house with 2 roommates, and Jordan had her own 1-bedroom apartment just off campus. One day, Jordan texted me after class and asked if I wanted to study later that night. I said yes because we did have a big test coming up. Jordan had told me that she had an off-campus job at a shoe store and asked if I could pick her up. She said her car was having problems and she had to walk to work that day. It wasn't a problem for me, and she gave me the address, which was roughly 5 minutes away from my house. Jordan said that she got off at 9 p.m., so I drove there and waited. I parked on the side of the street across from the store. It was a quieter side of town and an old shoe store that seemed like nobody went to. I had wondered why and how Jordan had gotten a job there. It was next door to a couple of other businesses, and I don't remember exactly what they were, but they weren't very popular. Across the street from them was like a wildlife park. I couldn't park directly across the street and had to parallel park a little ways down. I texted her that I was there and waited for a response. It was only 8:55, so I wasn't surprised when she didn't respond for the first couple of minutes. Then, 9 o'clock came and went, and there was still no response from Jordan. As I was sitting there waiting, suddenly I saw a man in front of my car. He must have walked out from the woods area that was next to the street. That was pretty creepy in itself. The man walked right up to my window and signaled for me to roll it down. I did roll it down, and the man leaned in. He asked if he could have a ride. This guy was already giving me the creeps. He had seemingly just emerged from the woods, and I had no clue who he was. He was wearing just a sweatshirt, jeans, and a beanie. Then he said to me he was going to need to get inside my car, or something like that. Then he started to reach inside. I followed my instincts and I whipped the car into drive and sped out of there. The guy yelled a few things as I left, but I have no clue what they were. I drove to the next street and my heart was racing. It wasn't until my phone started ringing that I remembered about Jordan. I hadn't even picked her up. I answered my phone and it was Jordan. She asked me where I had gone and said that she was outside looking for me. I told her about what had happened and said that I was on my way back. I was now worried about Jordan. If there was some guy that wanted to get into my car, I feared Jordan might be in danger. I drove back around the block to the street where the shoe store was. When I got there, the street was very quiet and seemingly empty, other than a few cars parked on the side of the road. I didn't see the man, so that was good. I parked where I had been before, but was very nervous. As soon as I parked, I called Jordan to tell her that I was there. She answered and told me that she was crossing the street, and I saw her up a ways. I was really glad to see her. She walked to my car and then opened the passenger's door. She got like halfway inside and then said that she had forgotten something and quickly left the car and started going to the rear of my vehicle. She left the door wide open and I leaned over to ask her what she was doing. But just then, the man appeared again. He came from the back side of my car and entered through the wide open door. I tried to put my car into drive again, but he grabbed my wrist. With my other hand, I opened my driver's door. We struggled for a few seconds with the man trying to grab me. I was able to make it just outside of my door, and when I did, I ran across the street. The man followed after me. All of the businesses and stores on that side of the street were now closed, and I had to run all the way down the sidewalk. I got around to the corner and could hear the man was still behind me. When I made it around the corner, I ran behind one of the buildings into an alleyway and hid there. I don't think he knew where I went, and he seemed to walk around the area for a bit and then turn back. I stayed there, hiding behind a dumpster, and I called the police, and then I called Jordan. She didn't answer, and I was really worried about her. I left my hiding spot to go back to the street. When I did, I saw that my car was now gone. I had left the keys in the ignition after all, so I wasn't too surprised. I called out for Jordan, but she wasn't answering me. I called her over and over on her phone as well, but she didn't pick up. Soon, the police arrived at the scene. I told them everything and about Jordan, who I couldn't locate. I answered a bunch of questions over the next hour or so, and then got a ride home. The next day, I was told that Jordan and the man had both been located. What surprised me was that they had been working together. It all made sense after I thought about it. I was really shocked though. I had considered her to be my best friend.
When I was younger, I worked for Starbucks for a while. Our store was in the shittiest part of the town, in a retail park. The area consisted of council flats, where the local council places druggies, ex-cons, and people who are on various benefits. So, although we had some nice customers who were there for a shopping spree, and there were quite a few shady people too. And this one guy came in and acted like a regular, asking every girl about how we were doing. He was really nice and chatty, but he made my skin crawl. The other girls loved him. The guy started to come daily. He usually came around 1 p.m. and stayed until closing, around 11 p.m. And sometimes, he was very pushy about staying even after closing. He always insisted on helping bringing in the outside furniture and stuff. Some managers and I were cautious, especially since we couldn't have anyone in the store after it was closed. He then started to pretty much groom these girls, asking if they were single, about their first boyfriends, and their favorite sex positions. Yeah, the youngest girl was 16. Mind you, I grew up with narcissistic parents, so I learned how to read people at a very early age. Also, I've always been interested in psychology, and I studied it for a few years. And this guy irked me from day one, but I was nice to him because I'm very passionate about not starving to death, so I needed this job. One day, he started to tell me that he had a fight with his parents, and they threw him out. He looked very sad, and told me that he now sleeps in his van, which was a white, unmarked van. However, since he knew that I was closing that day, he said he'd love to take me home, because it's not the nicest neighborhood. I almost laughed. This was such a textbook way to abduct young women. He was doing literally everything, just as my lecturer said that a serial killer or rapist would do. I just told him no, with a straight face, to let him know that I wasn't prey. He then moved on to the other girls, and I notified the manager about his creepy behavior in order to protect our young girlies. And one of them was this sweet, innocent, and a bit naive girl. The creepy guy, naturally, targeted her next, after my shift leader also laughed in his face. He told this young girl his sob story, and expected empathy, which he got. She agreed to be taken home by him, and she even offered him a couch to sleep on. Luckily, my manager was a mom and hen type, and she firmly told our young barista to be more careful about strangers, and that she would be going home with her. Also, creepy guy was banned from the store, and the manager notified the security around the park. But I'm afraid I don't have a happy ending to this story. All I know that the police were later involved somehow, and he disappeared from the area. So, creepy Starbucks guy who's after young innocent girls, let's not meet again.
Back when I was in elementary school, I had a lot of different friends. During those times, I went to several sleepovers, usually with my best friend James or some of my other good friends. At one point during 5th grade though, I remember that I had a friend named Orion. I was pretty good friends with Orion, but not like best friends or anything. I thought he was cool though. He was one of my newer friends because the previous year was his first at my school. I'd been to his house once before for his birthday, and I think his parents were rich or something because their house was super nice. He also had all the latest video games and a giant TV. So one day, he invited me over to have a sleepover at his house, and I was really excited. His mom called mine later in the day, and then the next day, I went to his house after school. When I got to Orion's house, I was surprised to see 2 other kids there. There were 2 guys who seemed to be our age, but I didn't recognize them. They weren't Orion's brothers because I knew he was an only child. He introduced me to them and said they were his friends from his last school. Their names were Joey and Thomas. I had no idea that Orion was having other friends over as well. It made me a little less comfortable because I didn't know these guys, but I figured that it would still be fun. Orion kind of started talking to Joey and Thomas and didn't seem to pay as much attention to me. He talked about things that I didn't really know about, and I felt like the odd man out. We played video games, but had to take turns because there were 4 of us and only 3 controllers. After hours of that, we finally decided to go to bed. We were all going to sleep in Orion's basement. They had a big room with several couches and also had a couple of air mattresses. 2 of us would take the 2 couches, and the other 2 would take the 2 air mattresses. I took the couch which was on the end of the room, closest to the stairs. I really didn't know what time it was when we all went to sleep, but it had to be pretty late. At one time during the night, I woke up. When I did, I saw that Thomas was crouched down at the end of the couch that I was sleeping on. He appeared to be going through my backpack. I mostly had school stuff inside of it, but had a bunch of other stuff as well. I was confused as to why he was doing this. Before I had a chance to sit up or ask him what he was doing, he stood up with my backpack in hand and walked out of the room. I sat up looking around wondering what Thomas, a kid I barely knew, was doing with my backpack. Everybody else was sleeping. About a minute later, I heard his footsteps coming back and I pretended to be asleep. When he was back in the room, I opened my eyes to see. I saw Thomas, but he no longer had my backpack, and my backpack was not back at the end of the couch either. Then, Thomas got back to his air mattress and went back to sleep. I fell asleep again shortly after, and the next morning when I woke up and my backpack still wasn't there, I confronted Thomas. In front of everybody after we were all up, I asked Thomas why he took my backpack during the night. I said that I had seen him. He started laughing, but I could tell in his face that he was nervous. He said that he never touched my backpack, and he didn't know what I was talking about. I described to him in detail what I saw, but he still denied it, and he started to get mad at me as well. I asked him where my backpack was, and then showed everyone how mine wasn't there. They suggested that I didn't even bring a backpack. Now this really made me mad, because it seemed like Joey and Orion were both taking Thomas's side. I told them that I was going home, and I needed my backpack. Then I called my mom. She came to pick me up, and even went inside Orion's house, and we both looked for it. But eventually, Orion's parents basically kicked us out and said that if it turned up, they would call us. I went home furious. Obviously, I had taken my backpack to Orion's house because I had gone there straight from school, and I always brought my backpack to school. Inside of my backpack, it was mainly school stuff like notebooks, folders, and pencils, but I also had some things of value, such as my Nintendo DS and several games for it, and other little knickknacks and some food. I told my mom all about what had happened, and she told me she would call Orion's parents again the next day if they didn't find it. This was a Saturday, and the next day, on Sunday, when I woke up, I went outside, and on the front step of my house was my backpack. However, it was open and emptied out, except for the school supplies. Literally everything was gone from it other than my notebooks, folders, and pencils. I was livid. The next day at school, I told Orion all about it, and surprisingly, he still took the side of his friend Thomas. He said that he had no clue how my backpack would end up at my front step, and then he got mad at me for accusing Thomas of stealing from me, and said that Thomas was his best friend. That basically ended our friendship, and I never hung out with him again, and barely even spoke to him for the next 2 years until he changed schools again. I really don't know who left my backpack at my front step. There's no way that Thomas would know where I lived. Overall, this was one of the creepiest things to happen to me. Many years ago, when I was about 12 years old, I had a sleepover at my best friend Kevin's house. Kevin was my best friend from the time I was about 5 years old until probably college. We are still friends to this day. We had countless sleepovers at either my house or his house, which were only a few miles apart from each other. Typically, it would be on a weekend, like a Friday night to Saturday, and I remember that one Friday, I went over to his house after school. Kevin's house was a split level. His bedroom was on the upstairs, and in the basement was where we hung out a lot. I really liked his basement because they had a bunch of snacks, a big fridge, and of course, a TV and video games. We went down there first and hung out for a while. I remember that Kevin's mom had to go take his sister somewhere, and his dad was at one of his friends' houses. We played video games into the night, and when it was dark out at probably like 8 p.m., all of a sudden we heard a noise coming from the door leading outside from the basement. We both paused the game and looked up at the same time. I think we both asked each other, "Did you hear that?" It was pretty unlikely that Kevin's parents or sister would be trying to enter through the back sliding door in the basement. Neither of us could see to the door from where we were, but it was just around the corner. Kevin slowly got up and peeked around the corner and motioned for me to wait where I was. When he did, he came sort of running back. He said that there was a guy there. I couldn't resist, and I got up and peeked around the corner as well. Kevin was right. There was a man standing at the back door, but it was really dark, and I couldn't tell any details about him. I ran back, and I don't think the man saw us, but to be honest, I really have no clue. We tried to figure out what to do. Neither Kevin or I had a cell phone, but luckily, there was a home phone in the basement. Kevin got it and called his dad and told him what was going on. He said his dad was coming home and should be back in like 10 minutes. In the meantime, we had to figure out what to do. I looked again to see if the guy was still there, and he was. We heard him try opening the door again. Thank goodness it was locked. Kevin and I didn't want to stay downstairs any longer, and we both ran upstairs. We went into Kevin's bedroom and shut the door. From there, we couldn't hear the man trying to open the door anymore, but we figured that we would be able to hear him if he got inside the house. Not too long after, we heard the front door opening, and then heard the voice of Kevin's dad. We went downstairs and showed him where we had seen the man, but the man was now gone. Kevin's dad went outside and looked all around the yard, which was about an acre. He came back a while later, saying whoever was there was now gone and he probably wouldn't come back. After that, Kevin and I played a little more video games until it got late. Then we went up to go to bed. Kevin actually had a bunk bed. I'm not sure why, because he had the whole room to himself, but I slept on the bottom bunk and Kevin slept above. It took me a while to fall asleep. Kevin seemed to fall asleep pretty quick, but I just wasn't quite as tired. I laid in bed relaxing and trying to get tired, but then I heard another noise. It broke the complete silence in Kevin's house. It was the sound of something hitting Kevin's bedroom window. Then I heard it again. I looked to the window, but saw nothing. My heart started racing, and I was telling myself that it was nothing, but I wanted to be certain, so I got up and went over to the window and looked outside. but when I did, I saw a guy standing down below looking right up at me. I jumped back and ran and woke up Kevin. He was super confused at first, but then got up and looked out the window. The man was still there. Kevin ran to his parents' room and woke them up. I stayed at the window and looked outside. The man was walking closer to the house, and before long, Kevin's parents entered the room and his dad walked over to the window. At that point, the man turned and ran away. The police were called, but when they arrived, the guy was long gone. The man didn't return for the rest of the night, and I went home the next morning. I was glad that I didn't live at Kevin's house, because I would have been really afraid that the guy would return. However, I never heard Kevin mention anything about him again.